on Slack a handful of times. I'll have arguments with Joe Olson, and he talks about like this ideal podcast where I would talk to like a top player and like be like get into the nitty gritty with the strategy or whatever. And what I don't have the heart to tell him is it's like it's a lot of times top players are just so hard to get to actually do the thing, you know, like because I spend a lot of my Star Wars CCG time making podcasts, you know, making content. And that's true of a lot of the other content creators. Like we're only going to be so good at the actual game because that's a partition there, you know? So, like a lot of times you end up like there are a bunch of people who, especially like the world champions who like it's like I have to eventually get to this person, and we'll end up just rescheduling like 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row, and then finally you get it. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, if you say yeah, we'll do it tonight. We're both free tonight. Okay. So.
By the way, is the sound okay?
Yeah, you're coming through just fine. I think I'm way less finicky about sound than a lot of podcasters. I think part of it is because I interview people who don't podcast regularly.
Yeah.
But I feel like as long as you sound as good as a telephone, then it's good. Skype cleans up the audio a little bit. That's part of the reason that I like using Skype. And then if it does, yeah, I don't hear any background noise or anything, but if there was background noise or any issues, then I can play around with it.
I just close the window just in case.
Yeah, you're coming through fine. I'm not getting any echoes. I'm not getting any room noise or anything. You know, it sounds like all the other stuff. And we've got a good connection, which is the most important thing. So
how does this work? Do you do you edit it, or do we just sort of like go right through?
So I edit it, yes. But it's minimal editing. It's mostly if there's a long awkward silence, or if like this doesn't usually come up, but if I get into an argument with my guest, I might cut that out, or if I start rambling about something, I do more editing when there's on the shows that I have like 4 people or something, because there'll be like crosstalk or just like I edited like of the top 8 that I'm in the middle of editing right now. I edited like 5 minutes because Chris Kelly was asking trivia questions that were too hard. So we're all like thinking. So if I ask you a question and you need to take a minute to think about it, I will edit that out with, you know, within reason. Like if like I'll leave enough space to tell that you were thinking about it, but if you have to think about something for 30 seconds, then I will edit that out, and I will. Yeah, but I don't. It's not like we talk for 2 hours and I cut it down to 45 minutes.
Yeah,
you know, it's because I don't know. I know it's not the best thing, but like. It's like I have, you know, we're talking, and theoretically anything we talk about is going to be of interest.
Yeah,
so,
and you value your time too. Like,
yeah. Some podcasts will be like, we'll talk for however long, and then I'm going to pull this piece out and this piece out and this piece out. And other shows, it's more. And I think, honestly, with Star Wars CCG, it's more important to have a lot of this stuff documented. Because I'm probably one of the only podcasts. I mean, maybe you've been on Holo Theater, but I'm going to be one of the only podcasts that, you know, goes in depth with you and your history with the game, and you're a historically significant figure and all that. So,
yeah, I know ChatGPT doesn't know about me.
Well,
it knows about some people, but it actually knows very little about like actual what happened.
Right.
Shows that it's not actually out there that much.
Yeah. Well, what I heard was that the version of an interesting thing that I heard, I don't know I don't know if it's true because I just heard it on Twitter, but that the free version of ChatGPT that everybody uses is much worse as far as making stuff up and facts and stuff than the paid version. It's like 3.5 versus 4.0. The 4.0 one is supposed to be better about that kind of stuff, but I don't know. I just I've been forgetting to ask this question for my last few guests. So, but I like to always ask, what did you have for breakfast today?
Actually, this is an interesting one. So there's, as Americans, you guys all know the New York style bagel.
Uh-huh.
But there's another better type of bagel, which is the Montreal style bagel.
Okay.
And so I had a Montreal style bagel with peanut butter.
What makes it Montreal style?
So it's like the New York bagels are these very fluffy, almost cake-like things, and the Montreal style is a lot it's a lot like thicker and more it's got like more oomph to it. But the big thing is they get cooked in a wood-fired oven.
Okay.
Like a beautiful outside on them, and a little bit sweeter, and just overall a better bagel.
So are you where are you in Montreal or?
No, I'm in Ann Arbor.
You're well traveled.
So I'm Canadian. So I went back to see my parents a couple of weeks ago, and I brought a dozen, put them in the freezer.
Cool. I know two Canadian Star Wars card players, you and Raphael Asselin, so must be a good country for Star Wars card players.
Yeah, there used to be. I mean, when I was in Canada, there were a bunch more, but everyone's sort of gone on to other things now.
Well, Worlds was in Toronto in 2014, right?
Yeah. Right, we had a Canadian advocate for a while. Cole Lepine was Canadian.
Yeah, interesting to think that we're sort of just U.S. and Europe. I've talked to the PC equivalents for a couple other games, and we're very centered in the United States and Europe, but like there are other games that are where it's like the core group is just in Europe, or they're they have North America and Latin America and Australia and everything. Of course, I think two of my patrons are actually from Australia, so we do have some Star Wars card players in Australia, but not really in the core group. Yeah. But so anyway, let's start at the beginning. How'd you get into Star Wars cards?
So I don't remember how old I was, like maybe 6 years old or something. And one of my friend's older brothers had some cards. And I guess somehow we ended up buying like a starter pack each, like the premier starter decks. And we didn't understand the rules, but we'd made our own game up. I think like every card was whatever was the picture, that was what the card was, right? So if you had like an interrupt that had a Star Destroyer, that was a Star Destroyer. And somehow we knew that you drew destiny for things, but like none of the, so these interrupts were moving around the table, doing various things. And then at some point, maybe when I was like 10 years old or something, I looked the rules up. I kind of figured out how to play. And I convinced my dad to take me to a couple tournaments back in Toronto. I think I went to maybe so this was maybe like 2000 or something. So I went to a couple tournaments, lost pretty much every game. And then I think the last one I tried to go to was when Lord of the Rings was starting to become a thing. I think maybe that was still, I think Star Wars, like they hadn't lost the license yet, maybe quite.
Yeah, there's definitely some overlap there.
Yeah, so I showed up to this tournament and everyone was just playing Lord of the Rings, and the tournament wasn't going. So that was sort of the end of that, and I switched over to Lord of the Rings like everyone else had. And then at some point, pretty much everyone probably has done this. 8 years later, you look it up again, and it turns out that people were still playing. And at that point, I was an adult, and so I started playing again. That was I think maybe 2010.
So when did you get good?
Uh,
When do you think you crossed over into being being the MHT?
Maybe like 2012. Uh, yeah, I think maybe 2012 I was pretty good. 2013, 2014 I was, felt like one of the best players.
Well, you won nationals in 2014, right?
Yeah, I think the time I felt the best was the Worlds that Desai won, which I think was 2013
Okay.
in Boston. I think it was. And I on day like the first day I was 8-0, and I felt very good about everything. And then around that time, Baroni was also winning a lot of things, and I was beating everybody else I felt, but every time I played him, I'd lose to him, and so I lost to him in the first round of the top 8. But other than that game, I was feeling very good right around then.
How do you because I run into that too, where there are certain players who honestly, I think there are certain players that I think they're better players than me, that I somehow end up winning against them a lot, and then there are other players who I'm I think I'm on the same level of, or maybe a little bit better, that I just can't beat them. How do you overcome that?
I mean, I think some of it is like play styles. So I think part of it was, when I play, I like to have everything very ordered and know what's going on. And Baroni's play style is much more like throw things into chaos. Right. And so there is a little bit of like, you like the game to go a certain way, and some people let you do that, and other people don't. And so part of it is you just, you figure out how to play in different kinds of games.
Right. Well, you're correct that it was the 2013 was Justin Desai won in Boston. I sometimes I interview people and they say years and they are wrong, so I wanted to double check you. You got your attention to detail, obviously. So let's see. I have too many notes. I'm all over the place. Before I forget, I'll ask I got one person actually gave me some questions to make sure to ask you on Slack, so I'll make sure to ask those. What's the best game you ever played?
Game of any kind, or like TCG card game?
Let's. Well, I think the best game of Star Wars CCG that you.
Okay. This is one of these ones where we might have to cut it out because I have to think for.
Well, I just spent a minute and a half looking up the questions, so
Yeah.
I'll definitely do some editing.
Um,
Or we can skip that question.
yeah.
And
I mean, so I have a whole class like I don't remember any particular game, but
yeah, that's fine.
So I used to play on Holotable back in the day before Jump was a thing. I think that's maybe again one of the how I got good is it's just playing on Holotable a ton. And the other person who was playing a ton on Holotable was Tom Kelly. And so we would run into each other a lot, and we'd play a lot and play test a lot. And we played a ton of Watch Your Step V against drops. And it got to the point where, like, we knew the counters, we knew the counters to the counters, and the counters to the counters to the counters, and it felt like this incredible chess match, where you sort of knew all the things that could happen and all the things available to you, but you always had so many decisions, and every game was different from every other game, but they were all like really really good games where there was tons of stuff happening. And I remember those games just being like great games. Lots of thinking.
So that was Legacy. That was Legacy Rops V and Legacy Watch Your Step V, which I don't remember Watch Your Step V at all, other than I've heard people say it's similar to Old Allies. Is there truth to that?
Like maybe superficially. So both decks had some systems out. Rops had the Reltier, but also other systems that would put out. Watch Your Step V would put out Corellia, and then they would play like 4 spaceport sites each of them. So they were both very much like spreading out decks. The more spaceport sites you occupied, the more bonuses you got. So a lot of it was, you would try to occupy your sites, but also stop them from occupying theirs, and vice versa. And in Watch Your Step V, that it was you would play like Jedi Masters who were fully immune, and then you would play all these little Corellians, and basically the objective would make it very hard to hit the Jedi Masters with weapons. And then the little Corellians would occupy the sites and give you bonuses. So they would add to your battle destiny like ROPS. But then instead of where ROPS does the force drain -1, Watch Your Step V had something kind of like Old Allies where you would reduce damage once per turn.
And then the old ROPS V versus the current ROPS V, was it a similar deck?
Yeah, and sort of play style. There were sort of differences, but mostly like superficial ones. Which systems did you play and things like that. Which cards got canceled.
Every 6 months, what ROPS V is changes a little bit.
Right.
with the amount of errata that it's gotten over the years, but okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I could never really get into Holotable because I don't know what cards do, or at that time especially, like I didn't know what cards did, so I'd be having to read every single card, and then maybe you've got chat with the person, but I couldn't get. Gemp was just a lifesaver for me because like you can I think Gemp is it's a lot better when you can't have that communication. I did a little bit of Holotable over Skype, and that helped.
Holotable, it's got a much steeper learning curve, but once you're like really proficient at it, I feel like things go a lot faster almost. One of the nice things about Gemp is that you got the rules so that sometimes there's bugs and things, but generally the rules are enforced and things like that. So you don't have to worry about like if there's some big tournament like when we had Worlds Online, we're not worrying about the two players making some rule mistake in game.
Right. Yeah, I mean the number of times that I showed up to a tournament back in those days, not that I played in that many tournaments, but just like my cards didn't do what I thought they did.
Yeah.
Now at least I get the games that on Gemp. I would imagine, because you said you played on Holotable at that time, do you think that you were then getting in more reps than most people because people were just playing mostly in person?
Yeah, probably. So maybe the thing that really helped is so I was playing a ton on Holotable, but then at some point I moved to California, and I was playing with a couple people down there in person also. And so it was sort of the combination of like playing in person a bunch, so you get the feel for the cards, right? The actual you get used to tracking in person and things like that. But also you get all the reps in online against like the great players like CryptoFist was on Holotable all the time, as well as Tom Kelly, right? So the combination of those.
Yeah.
These days when I show up to a tournament, I feel like I haven't touched cards for the last year.
Uh-huh.
It feels weird at first.
Yeah, I know what you mean. When I go through a phase where I don't have a lot of in-person play, but I'm just on Gemp, then there's like I don't totally buy. I think there's obviously a correlation between being good on Gemp and being good in real life, but I do think that there is like if you just played on Gemp and you never picked up physical cards, I do think you're at a little bit of a disadvantage going.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's because you're bad at Star Wars. I'd say like it's just because you're now doing something in a very different environment from what you used to, right? Like, if you'd played in person all the time, but suddenly I told you like play in person, at a beach with music blaring, you might suddenly be a lot worse because you're not used to that, right? And if I put different sleeves on, like if I made you play in top loaders, right? Like all these sort of superficial things would get you out of the zone.
Oh yeah, I get thrown off when my opponent is playing double sleeved and I'm playing single sleeved. So I look and it looks like their piles are all bigger than mine. And then when I'm good, I kind of flip it around and I'm like, oh, actually, I know, I'm self-aware that their piles just look like they're bigger than mine, but I'm actually doing okay. And now my opponent maybe thinks that But
whereas on cheap, like it's much easier to get, you just look at the size of all the piles, you know exactly what's going on, right? So it takes time in person to figure out exactly, you can check that stuff less often, right? You can't every second say like, how many cards do you have? How many?
right. Do you feel like you ask people to count their piles more now that Gemp is a thing when you're playing in person?
No, I think just when I'm in person, I focus on different things slightly, right? You do a little less of that sort of very counting type thing, and there's other things like you're looking at the person and things like that.
I ask him to count. Half the time it's because I'm trying to figure out what I want to do anyway. So you can not exactly stall for time, but have something happen while I'm figuring stuff out. So you took a break and then came back in 2020. What caused you to step away from the game?
Really the reset. So I think, for me, nostalgia was very different from a lot of other people because I'd really only started in 2010, right? I'd played like a couple games back in 2000, but not enough to make me have like any attachment. I wasn't playing the good decks. I was like starting some random 2-1 site that I had in my collection. Right, so I didn't have any like attachment to the sort of classic decks. So for me, the nostalgia was really for these decks from 2010, 2011, 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the reset, right, all of those got taken away.
Right.
And for other people, it was great because they got to play, Hunt Down Again or whatever. I forget exactly what things were good after the reset. But for me, it was, all my favorite cards had just disappeared. And the style of play had become very different. Or the style of play used to be back in the Decipher days, and so like right after the reset, it was a lot more about sort of tricks, like things like Overload, Brangus, right? All these things from your hand. Whereas I'd gotten very used to a game that was much more focused on characters on the table moving around, battling each other, and I felt like post reset it was a lot more about sort of almost like a kind of more solitaire, like of tracking, and you try to find the canceller for the other person's overload while they try to overload you 3 times in a row, as opposed to this, something that felt more interactive of moving characters around on the table and solving that kind of puzzle.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel whenever I try to play a Decipher format. I'm like, I build it. I'm like, I feel like this game should be about controlling sites and winning battles.
Yeah, like one of the great things about the game is like, there's the move phase, there's different locations, right? It's not just like Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh where everything is in the same place, right? There's this like dimensionality to things. And to me, that's like one of the great things in the game, but I feel like that was sort of missed, or at least overshadowed through a lot of the Decipher cards, just because these cards that you just like played from your hand and they did something were much more powerful than the ideas of moving around.
And the sense that I've gotten is that Decipher wanted it to be more like the game that we have now, where it is about doing the thematic things. That's what objectives are all about. Reenacting the stuff from the movies, and at its heart, winning battles and controlling sites, as opposed to just like sometimes you play certain Decipher formats and it's like every single card you play they cancel it with Sense or Alter, or you go back and forth with Sense and Alter, or and it just doesn't. It's like you're playing a game with a different set of rules.
Yeah, and you've only got one good character on each side way back, like when you play the really old things.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's all about like you put them somewhere and that side's sort of locked down, and then they just sense things, and the other person puts their character somewhere else, but you're not like really. I don't know. It didn't feel like you're. Yeah, it doesn't feel like you're moving things around as much.
Now, I do think that that's actually something interesting to bring up. Back, in the earlier game, personas had, I think, a little bit more value than they have now, where you had, there's 3, like in the whole Decipher era, there's you basically have Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and Luke, and like maybe Mace or maybe Yoda that are like fighting Jedi, and then you have Vader, Maul, Insidious, and Emperor for dark side. You have these like, you can count on one hand your super powerful characters, and everybody else is maybe a step back from that. Whereas now, the number of characters that are power 5, ability 5 is much larger. How do you think that has impacted the feel of the game?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that, if you were going to redesign the game, I think the big mistake is that they made the deploy costs too low for these big characters, or at least maybe they were fine for the time, but at this point, the way activation works, right? As soon as you can start pulling locations, the deploy cost on a Vader or a Luke is not actually that much, right? It's, deploying a guy for 5 or 6. Yeah, you can't deploy 3 guys, but you're not saving up over multiple turns or anything like that. And then it creates this sort of downwards pressure on everything else. That if you're going to deploy something for 3 force, then 2 of them had better be better than Darth Vader, right? Because you're spending 2 cards in the same amount of force, and your opponent's just spending 1 card. But so that means like the things that cost 3, it's really hard to make them good. So then they start becoming like, oh, now they cost 2 or they cost 1, right? And then once things cost 1 or 2, you can play a bajillion of them in a turn, and like deploy costs start to not matter so much. So I think really what they should have done is I mean, they didn't know what that, right? It's so many years in the future that they
Right.
have so many personas, but I think really the strong personas should have been sort of stronger cards, but also their deploy cost should have really been in line with that.
So where you're paying 8 force or 12 force or something. Yeah.
For Luke, but that's okay because he's going to take on so many characters.
Right. And you could even like, I mean, you probably don't want. It probably wouldn't be good for the game, but like, you could maybe do that now. You would just have to change what the stats are. But I also think like where I struggle. I mean, I think it's the best game in the world, but you talk about pulling locations. It's not just, to me, it's not just that you pull locations, it's that you get them all out on the first turn, or the first turn or 2. Like, in Magic, you can play 1 land a turn, and that means that the things that cost 1 can come out early, and the things that cost 6 take a little while to play. With Star Wars, you can deploy Vader on turn 1 if you want to.
Yeah, so I think it is somewhat overstated, this idea that there's like no early, mid, late game for Star Wars. I think there very definitely is sort of an early, mid, late game. The mid game can happen on turn 2 or 3, but it can also take until turn 4 sometimes. And it's really about, at what point when you there's some phase in a game where you can put a character down and expect that it'll survive till the next turn. Right. And depending on the matchup, that can be a very different amount of time. Right. There's still so the early, when you can put that Darth Vader down and think, yeah, he'll probably survive around to my next turn and I can drain with him when I want. That's sort of the early game. And then the mid game is when you have to start thinking a lot more about where you're putting things. Right. And sometimes by the second turn, you have to say like, okay, now like anything could happen. My opponent could play all sorts of cards. But there's still, some games you draw for the first 2-3 turns. You just get ready things up, right? Because you're sort of maneuvering your hand.
So yeah, and I guess I would, to sort of to tack onto that, when you say play a guy and they stay there, it doesn't necessarily mean just play them and you don't have any backup in your hand. Because there's a very big difference between playing a lone character on turn 1 or 2, and spending all your force and you don't have a barrier or a gick, and versus if you do have that support. But I agree that there's definitely an early to mid game, but we don't have is the resource curve.
It's over pretty quickly.
That generates that type of dynamic.
Yeah. So, but so if you were going to try to make the resource curve, like the problem is that the locations are in your deck, right? And so you could say something like, yeah, you can only deploy one location per turn. That might be the way to do it, because if you still have it as many locations as you want, then the problem is that like you draw a couple extra and now you're just throwing them all over and you're way ahead of your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
So that was maybe like, going back to sort of an original design flaw, the fact that your locations are just floating in your deck.
But also, well, the game wouldn't be the same without those flaws.
Right.
All right. So okay. So how do you feel the game is different? Or how do you feel that the game changed between immediately post reset and when you came back in 2020?
Yeah. So I think when I came back, it felt a lot more like it felt when I was enjoying things a lot more. That really your cards on the table did matter a lot. Especially, I think when I came back, that was when people were playing these 30 character decks. Or even like 35 character decks, right? And so that was really all about your characters on the table doing things, and it wasn't about like playing sort of silly games with the cards in your hand and 3PO and tracking and things like that, right? You weren't overloading things because your opponent had 5 characters anyway, and getting rid of one didn't really do anything. So I think when I came back, maybe you guys had been having that for a little bit, but for me, it wasn't really old yet. So I enjoyed that.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you came back in 2020 and you have that observation. I came back. I left after the reset, partially for personal reasons. I got a job that was going to make me work every Saturday until the end of time, so I was never going to be able to go to another tournament. But I left shortly after the reset, and Dorsch also left after the reset. And Dorsch was very vocal that he liked the just sort of the general power creep of late legacy, just the power level of cards, and he felt when he came back in about 2019 that we were just getting to where the game felt like that. So I think all three of us, sort of, and then of course people were calling for a reset as early as 2019, but I think all three of us sort of, I think I totally agree with what you're saying. Like I don't think it feels like Legacy, because Legacy was a little bit wilder, and there were cards with 12 lines of text on them and everything. But I think that what everybody's been trying to do is closer to what the game is now.
Yeah, and people weren't really playing that many of those cards with 12 lines of text, right? They existed, but a lot of the cards you were playing were normal cards with reasonable amounts of text at the time. But yeah, I think it's, to me, like I didn't mind how powerful things were. It was more just I liked the play style, and I feel like that play style was sort of re-achieved at some point before I came back.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. So talk to me about being on design. How did you get on design?
So I was on design back in sort of 2013, 2014. Maybe I think even maybe a little bit after the reset. But so of course when I left left design also. And then when I came back, I joined playtesting for a little bit at some point, and then Chris Kelly said like, hey, I guess we got an opening on design. Would you like to come back and join design again? And so I said yes. Yeah.
What advice do you have to the many randoms out there that would love to be involved with design? What do you think the best pathway to that opportunity is at this point?
So I think definitely like through playtesting, and I think the big thing to show is like a lot of people want to be on design because they have a deck that they like and they want to design cards for it that everyone else is going to think are crazy, right? Because they're going to come up with like they want to have a single card that solves all that deck's problems. And so I think what you want to do is you want to be on, like, if you want to be on design, it's because you want to sort of trying like you want to try new things, you want to bring balance to the game, you want to take the game in new places that are still fun places. And so I think sort of being on playtesting, trying out, so showing that you're sort of like part of a team, right? Part of the playtesting team, and not just trying the decks that you really like, but trying other decks, having like good feedback. I think that's definitely a place that, on design, we know who the people on playtest. We know there's certain people on playtesting where like, we always get good feedback from these people. They always try lots of things out. They give, reasonable feedback. And sort of that commitment to like the game rather than your own personal decks, I think is an important thing.
What's your favorite thing about being on design?
So I mean, the game's been around for what? Did we said like the 25th anniversary? Or no, 20th anniversary.
Yeah. So the PC has been around for the 20th anniversary was April of 22.
Yeah.
But the game itself was around for 5 or 6 years before that. So we're coming up. I think we're past 25.
Right. Yeah. So almost probably getting near 30 years now. Yeah. I guess like 2025 would be 30 years. Right. So that's a long time. A lot of cards have been made. And I think one of the fun things is just trying to figure out like what's a kind of card that we haven't made yet. What's a new way to do things that hasn't been done. There's some cards that I'm trying to get the other people in design to agree to let me make, which is just an interrupt that only says add 1 battle destiny. And it's very hard. It's one of those things that's so simple, right? How has nobody in the last 30 years made a card that just says add 1 battle destiny? The problem is, you've got to balance it. What's the right destiny? If it's Destiny 4, maybe it's too strong. If it's Destiny 3, maybe it's too weak. But it's one of those cards that I feel like, someone should have made it at some point in the last 30 years. Right. So they're sort of trying to identify like simple things like that. I find very fun that really should have been done ages and ages ago. Right. But haven't been. And then the other thing is like, so Star Wars is a really hard game to design for because you really have access to any card in your deck pretty much whenever you want, right? As long as, it's about priorities, right? You can't just say like, I want this card right now. But if there's a card that you really want to have in your hand, you can get it into your hand, just at the cost of, not doing other things instead. But it means that if you have to be really, really careful because any card you make, anybody could have that in their hand with any other card almost all the time. And so if something's like going to be abusive, they could abuse it. So how do you make interesting new mechanics that won't be completely abused like that? I think that's really fun. So the Flip Falcon, for example, is a really cool example of that, where we had vehicles and we had starships, but in Star Wars you see these starships go and they fly around planets also, right? And so how do you have that show up in the game? And you have to stay within the rules and things like that. And I think the Flip Falcon was like an excellent solution to that. The one thing I wish is you almost always have it as a starship, maybe like 90% of the time. And I think it would be great if it was a little bit more often a vehicle. But
Well, I mean, it is a starship.
Right.
Thematically, that makes sense that it would most of the time be a starship. But
and it is sometimes a vehicle, and you have to remember, like, yeah, I can land this in it, and it's going to be, great at holding a site somewhere.
Yeah, and make sure and if you're playing on GEMP, make sure you don't accidentally flip it because it only flips once per turn, and it'll end up when you need because a vehicle, a combat vehicle versus a landed starfighter are two very different things at a site.
Right.
So I've got a new segment for this episode that you're going to be my guinea pig for. We've already sort of been talking about a lot of like nuts and bolts of the game and stuff, but this segment is called how to make Joe Olson better at Star Wars cards. I've received some feedback from some people that there's a demand for just top players to give some real, deep tactical and strategic nuts and bolts advice on getting better at Star Wars cards. So I'm going to ask you just a few questions, and just feel free to talk as long or as short as possible. But I'm just trying to get the way that you are one of the top players out there, and just trying to get your the way that you think about it. So one of the things that I think a lot of people find just completely impenetrable with Star Wars CCG is tracking. So how do you approach tracking?
So I think the first thing is that tracking is nowhere near as important as people think it is. You can go entire games without tracking because it's not worth the mental effort compared to like making good decisions, right? So to start out for tracking, I would basically say like focus on your in-game decisions, but then sometimes you'll recognize that there's like one really important thing you need to do some tracking for, right? So something like there's if you're playing like ROP, say, and there's a layout with a blaster rifle in front of you, that's something you have to get rid of, and getting rid of it in a battle is going to be very, very costly. So you want to get rid of it with something like a trample, or you want to choke her with Darth Vader or something like that, right? And those are things that require tracking. So then you say, okay, this is going to be like one of these like key tracking points. And at that point, right, when you just have to do something like next turn, you just figure out a way to get a 6 down into your use pile. You just count things and you get it. And right, so that's like the vast majority of tracking for most players should probably just be that kind of tracking, right? Rather than the tracking things turn over turn. Then the second thing you should do, I think, is recognize certain game states where tracking is more important than making decisions on the board. And I think the classic example of this is when you're playing against Bring 'Em Before Me, and they're getting near to the point where they could actually turn Luke, right? So they've got that if they lose a duel and then win the next draw, that you would just lose the game, right? And at that point, often they've moved Darth Vader off somewhere, and so you've actually got board control. So what's happening on the board doesn't matter so much. It's really all down to will they turn Vader or not. And at that point, that's when you really should like start focusing on the tracking if you're not so used to it. So I think the first thing is just recognizing those situations where you do need to track and how much you need to track, rather than just sort of not necessarily tracking all the time. Of course, like if you're practicing, you should practice tracking more than you do it in an in-game tournament. But I think the first thing is right to recognize like when you're in a tournament how important tracking in that situation is versus making other decisions.
Do you usually track from the top or from the bottom?
I usually track from the bottom. Although
that's really interesting. That's really interesting because you're like, I think a lot of people assume that you track from the top, but a lot of people track from the bottom. Sorry, go ahead.
It probably has to do with like where you learn to track also, because like I sort of really learned to track online. You see that count of the pile moving underneath. And so it's just a natural number to keep track of, right? And there's cards coming off the top all the time. So you have to pay a lot more attention to those, right? If you're tracking from the bottom, then generally you just like keep track of one number, and at the end of each turn, you just change that number a little bit.
Right. And a lot of time, what I've found is a lot of times when I'm doing the most tracking is like you said, toward the end game when some of those key destinies can be really important, or like if I'm trying to cycle a used interrupt, it's got to do with when it's the card I'm 3POing is the card that I'm tracking, and a lot of times that's early in the turn. And if I'm trying to track from the top down, then sometimes I forget that I paid 3, especially playing online, because you don't have the tactical memory of paying 3 to 4 strain or something like that. That was a big thing for me was realizing that tracking from the bottom can be really helpful.
Well, Well, and then like you accidentally lose, you lose a card to a force drain, or you do this, you do that, and then you have to remember every single one of those.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. You forget. Yeah, you forget that you top deck something, and then it throws off the thing.
Yeah.
I'll ask you one more nuts and bolts question. This is something that I've been struggling with. I always deploy too soon. But you're talking about, you were talking earlier about sort of that early game, and sort of the way that I took it is like, when is it safe for me to deploy a card? When is it worth it for me to deploy a card? And how much, how do you decide whether, am I going to deploy Vader or am I going to draw 6 cards in those early turns? How do you, what considerations do you go through for stuff like that?
I think that there's some very obvious things. One is like, if you ever deploy a character and your opponent doesn't react to them, and then you don't force drain with them the next turn, right? So this is when battle plan is in effect, right? So you deploy Vader, your opponent doesn't do anything, and then on your turn, you count your cards, you look at your force, you say, I'm not going to pay to drain with Vader. That probably means that you shouldn't have deployed Vader, right? Because maybe there's sometimes you got his lightsaber out from your deck, right? And so that was good to make sure that got out. But a lot of the time that means that, why are you playing him now when you could have played him the next turn? So that's one thing, right? Is like, what was that character doing for you that turn? So Star Wars, right? The deploy phase happens before the battle phase. So a character that's in your hand is basically anywhere on the table. And, you keep your force, right? So if you don't deploy him this turn, you could deploy him next turn, and that's exactly the same, except you got an extra turn of information. So that's a big thing to think about, I think, is like, what did that character do on the table for you during that turn? Of course, like later in the game, right, you've got considerations like, if you don't spend your force, then it won't recirculate and you won't activate it again the next turn. So late in the game, your force really does sort of disappear at the end of a turn. But for early on, your force just stays there, right? So no reason to spend it if you don't want to, or if you're not getting something from it now. So that's one big thing to consider. Another is that a character on the table might never battle. So I've seen people, I think there's a game when I was playing ROPS and someone deployed Leia, like maybe on their first turn, they deployed Leia with their blaster rifle to a Reltier site. And, maybe they thought like they're controlling that site or something, but, Leia's not really doing anything. She's maybe at most going to drain for 1. And she's only going to drain for 1 once they're occupying battle plan, like they've got a system also. But the most important thing is, I know for the rest of the game, is the ROPS players, the dark side, that she's never going to battle. Because there's no way I'm like deploying things in front of her, unless I really, maybe I decide I really want to battle her. But I have the option of just avoiding her for the entire game.
Right, and you could deploy in front of her to get your locations to flip and then just move away.
She's not stopping me from flipping. She's making it very slightly harder for me to flip. But like, it's not significantly harder, and she's one of their best characters against me. Right. So a character in the hand can still battle, but a character on the table can no longer battle. Right. There's entire decks where like QMC, right, where a whole bunch of your game plan is to choose the opponent's, 2 best characters and say, I'm never going to fight these guys. Right. I'm going to fight all their other characters possibly, but these 2 guys I'm never going to fight, because I'm going to, barrier 1 and path away from another. So when you deploy a guy, you're telling your opponent that, like, if you want, as long as you're okay giving up this 1 location, you never have to battle this character ever again.
Right. And in certain matchups, giving up a location, it's like there's 100 locations. That's really interesting, because that was one of the things. I still lose to Diplo all the time, but one of the things that made it so that I didn't lose 100% of the time was realizing that, they've got their one guy that sits there and draws Battle Destiny. They've got something in their hand to make it so I'm not going to overflow them if I put 5 guys in front of them. But if I put 5 guys in front of them, then they'll deploy 1 guy at each of the other sites, and my guys are all stuck at 1 site.
Right, and you have to say sort of how much is like a reasonable amount of overflow to go for, right? You could try to go for 20 and you'd win right then if you actually got it. But often it's better to say like, oh, I'll try to do like 5 overflow, right? That's enough that like they'll probably want a Hujix anyway, right? So it's the same outcome. And if you got the 5 overflow, then like great, that's a huge difference, right? You don't need to win the game right then. But yeah, I think it's all about like thinking like every time you deploy a character, that's something you've spent, and you have to think, what are you getting back from that? And it depends on where you're putting, right? Sometimes when you deploy a character, that character is gone forever because they're at a site that's not adjacent to any other sites or something. Sometimes you deploy a character because you know that they can go anywhere they want, and you're never going to want to battle with them, and so that's just as good as having them around.
Right. Yeah, like 3PO, you're probably gonna 3PO with his parts showing, you're gonna deploy him
right
somewhere just so you can do, or whatever, some equivalent, somebody that has some game text that you want to
or like if you're like QMC, you might deploy one of your bad aliens to the 1-0 site because they're bad at battling. You probably won't want to deploy them to battle anyway, and you can immediately teleport them anywhere you want. So they're sort of effectively, you've sort of pre-spent the force, so you can recirculate it and things like that. But that character could basically be anywhere.
So I like that. I'm officially. I think this is a good. You were a good person to test this segment out on. I was just going to ask 2 questions, but I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll go into the Pivo questionnaire. So this one should be a relatively quick answer, but so battle plan, battle order. When is it worth it to pay 3?
Almost never, I think. So what you have to think is like everybody knows about the time value of money,
right?
But I think very few people think about the time value of force enough. Any force you have on that first turn is worth an enormous amount because anything you do with it, that's something that's sitting there for the rest of the game. Right? If you draw a card, that's one more card you have as an option for the rest of the game. If you deploy another character, that character can force drain every single turn for the rest of the game. They add their power in every single battle for the rest of the game. Right? Like think about like if you got to just like add a free 3 power to a battle for the entire game, that's huge, right? And so that little bit of thing doing at the beginning can get you that. If you get to add 3 power to one battle somewhere like on the 6th turn, that's nothing. Right? So those early on force are worth way more than those force later on. And these battle plan, right? Usually when you're thinking battle plan or right battle order, you're thinking like, 2nd turn, 3rd turn, am I going to pay to drain? And what's that going to do? That's going to make them lose maybe 2 cards, right? And so you have to think like, I'm spending 3 force. 3 force might lose me the like board control, right? Control over the board. My opponent might just sort of take over everything, stop everything I'm doing. Is it worth potentially losing board control to make them lose those 2 cards? Right? Am I going to sort of kill them fast enough that those 2 cards will matter versus that 3 extra force that they have to do everything? So I guess you want to be thinking like, what's the role of my deck? And what would I be doing with that force? So sometimes you end up in a situation where you're not really going to do anything with those force, right? If you're a space deck and you're playing against a ground deck, that's all about damage, right? You're not going to be deploying things and battling. You're not really going to be using those force. So there your sort of your scarce resources control phases in which to drain. And so you want to maximize the number of times you can drain, right? The number of control phases in which you drain. So you're going to start paying to drain almost immediately. But if you are playing, say, like a mains deck against old allies, and you've deployed on your first turn a Jedi, say, to their site, if you pay to drain, that's just giving them more time to figure out how to start like playing It's a Hit or Leia Rebel Princess, stopping a lot of your damage and really getting control of the board, right? And especially once you start paying to drain, you have now less force to satisfy battle plan, right? So what might happen, like it might be that if you deploy something your first turn, you save your force your second turn, your third turn you satisfy battle plan, and from then on you're draining for free. If you drained on your second turn, well then maybe you drain again on your third turn. You no longer have enough force on your third turn to go to space, right? So now your fourth turn you're stuck paying again, and now at that point like you've paid 9 force to drain 3 times, and now your opponent like deploys something and kills the person who is draining, and now you're stuck with nothing. Right. So I think you have to think
combine
like,
the last two questions. You don't want to deploy a character if you're not going to drain, and
and
you don't. You usually don't want to pay. You usually don't want to drain. So that's probably why you don't drop. You don't always drop a character on turn one.
right. Now, when you start draining, is sometimes you want to force the other person to do something. So this is something that especially Desai started doing a lot, and everyone else, sort of followed him. Is in Old Allies, you've got this Falcon sitting here, and it's quite cheap. You want to fly the Falcon up pretty quickly anyway, and you've got some guys that are pretty easy to put on it, right? You can put like Radis and Ray or something. And one of the reasons you want to do that quickly is that you want to make sure you do actually pull Ray, right? You don't want to miss the pull later on. So now you've got this Falcon sitting at the system. It can drain for 2. And you've got usually an interrupt that you can play to add 1 to the drain. And you're kind of content to just sit there, right? Like what you really want as Old Allies is you want the other person to deploy things to other places so that you can deploy things to even further other places and avoid them, right? You don't really want to be battling. And so it makes sense that when you might be in this sort of situation where you deploy to space, they don't really want to deploy anyone because they want to battle with their characters. And so what you do is you start just draining every turn, right? Because you say like, oh, I'm going to drain until you deploy something, and you force them to deploy first, really. So I think an understanding of a lot of matchups is about what should the order of who deploys what when be, right? And if I don't want to deploy first, how can I do something small that will force my opponent to do something bigger next so that I can react to that? And sort of how long should I? So in Old Allies, you might not drain on the second turn, because if you drain on the second turn, you've sort of lost a bunch of force, and then your opponent might on their third turn deploy a bunch of stuff, and now you're sort of behind on reacting. But by the time it gets to your third turn, you've probably activated a bunch of force. You've got a whole bunch of force sitting there, and you might as well spend some of it draining to force some action. Yeah, so I think it's really all understanding like who has to do what first, right? Who's like obligated? If both players, first thing you should do when you sit down is you should think, if we both just sat here and stared at each other, who gets the advantage out of that? Right, and that tells you like who should do what action first, and then how should the other person be responding to that, and things like that.
Yeah, because like it's interesting you say it's almost never. When I play There Is Good in Him, I'm paying to drain a lot because there are certain matchups where I move Luke to the docking bay, and he just sits there all game, draining for 2 consistently all game, and then we play the game, but my opponent loses 2 force a turn, and I pay 3 force a turn. And if they come after Luke, then they're really playing my game. But I'll have to. I don't even know if that's correct or not. But that
is one of the strengths is that you like. Is there, the rest of your deck is a very reactive deck. You want your opponent to be deploying first, but you've got this sort of built-in way to force them to do something, right? Because if they don't do something, you do move Luke over and you just start draining for 2, and that says like now you got to do something.
And also Luke is activating 2 extra force, so that makes it not hurt quite as bad.
Right. And then at some point you might decide like this is not forcing them to do something fast enough, right? Here's this like sometimes you decide here's this juicy site. If I go to these 2 sites, now I'm draining for 5. And maybe 5 is enough to win the game, right? So then like that might start be worth paying for, because if you do enough, then they'll die before they can take advantage of the fact that you've spent more force than them.
Okay. So that was really helpful. Is there anything autobiographical that we haven't talked about? Do you have any interesting stories that I should have asked you about? I feel like we've talked a lot about how to play Star Wars cards, but
yeah.
other than a few little tidbits.
I guess we didn't talk about why I came back.
Yeah.
In 2020, which is basically, I think it was like March or April 2020, and I was in New Zealand at the time, and we were locked. Like, I mean, no one knew what was happening, but we were locked down much more than the States was. Um, right. So you literally, like, you only left your house to go grocery shopping. There was no takeout. Nobody was going to work unless it was, very, very important. Um, and I was, everyone was trying to figure out things to do. And I was sort of like, oh, I wonder if like people are still playing Star Wars. If they are, then I discovered they were, and not only were they, but everyone had moved to playing online suddenly, right? Because Jump had become a big thing since I'd last checked in. And so then it was very easy to just start playing again because you had all this time and nothing to do with it but be on the computer. Right, and then I forget if it was the first or second tournament I played in. I think maybe first I played in an NPC and didn't do so well, but then there was like Texas Mini Worlds that I won, and then I was like, oh, this is fun again. And I liked the kind of decks, I liked the ISB and the No Idea and things like that. And so then I just kept playing. Although it was tough playing like the tournaments from New Zealand because the time difference. Yeah. So Worlds would be from like from midnight till 8 a.m. or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I remember, I think there's the Worlds that had like 2 days of Swiss play.
Uh-huh.
And like that, I think so it was like, I was like dead tired by the end. And I remember I forget exactly what happened, but I think I had some battle where I had like Leia and he'd cracked her immunity to attrition, but I hadn't realized it or something because I just wasn't like, I hadn't like not enough brain focus to figure that out. And so I just started losing all the battle damage first. I lost like 7 battle damage because I thought I was going to keep her around. And then I got to the end and it was like, you still have to do something. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got to lose her too.
We've all been there.
Thanks.
Not usually in games that are super important, but we've all certainly been there.
Yeah. And then, it was just like 10 in the morning or 8 in the morning or something. I was just like, I'm going to bed. This is done.
I mean, I was in Eastern time and that tournament was still miserable for me because I was trying to be accommodating, and when they said which pod, I said no preference, so they stuck me in the Euro pod. So my first game was at 4 a.m. And then like I didn't do well, and the games were every round was an hour and a half, and I ended up with people dropped from our pod, so I ended up with 2 buys. So it was like 10 hours of play, and I got to play like 4 games. Yeah, that was a rough event. But then I did commentary, and that was fun. So
yeah, I think like I had sort of no option of a good time, right? Because they're sort of accommodating the North Americans and the Europeans.
Right.
And they're not going to make a pod for me and the 2 Australians.
you and Drew Lichtenstein, wasn't Drew in China at the time?
Yeah, I think he was.
Yeah, because he said he had a very similar story to you, where he was where they were super locked down when he was in China, and that was when he got back into things.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and transition into the old Pivo questionnaire. This is the questionnaire I ask all my guests. It is based off of James Lipton's Inside the Actor's Studio. Interpret the questions however you'd like. Some of them don't totally make sense. Just a lot of them mirror each other. So if I say, what's a thing you like, don't say not the thing I don't like. So first question, what is your favorite card?
It's probably Rebel Barrier and Imperial Barrier. I just find there's so many options of what you can do with them. Right, you can, and you have to think really, like they're probably going to get grabbed a lot of the time, or you're only going to be able to play them so often and things like that. But they really open up the options that you have to play with, but they also make your opponent think a lot about what they're going to do. And so I think they add a lot to the game, right? They make it so it's not just like, oh, I can't deploy any weenie characters because they're just going to get completely beat down, right? They say like, there is some value. They sort of help you we talked about this sort of early game, mid game, late game, right? They sort of help things happen sometimes because there are situations where you might not deploy anything because you know that guys are just going to get killed. But when you have the barrier, that does let you do something, right? You can say, okay, one guy will get killed, but another guy he'll like be protected by a barrier, so he'll stick around. And then like I have another guy who never got attacked, and so like now I have some board presence. I can start doing things.
Yeah, and it all it does a lot of it definitely does a lot of interesting stuff. I like that's a really good answer. I like
and
the
they're simple, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And then there's also all the game, like do I barrier the first person they deploy, the second person, might they get somebody better? You have to know who's in their deck. So I know like when we were playing like Old Allies against Shadow Collective, it was like, or maybe even No Idea against Shadow. No, I think it was Old Allies against Shadow Collective. It was like the barrier is always going to be saved for Dr. Evazan. Like no matter how much you might think that you want to barrier somebody else, like Dr. E is the guy because he's the one who like really ruins your day.
What is your least favorite card?
It's hard to pick one, but sort of a class of cards is things that sort of close down interaction and really lock down a site. So things like I know a lot of people like him, but Lord Sidious, because there's a lot of times when you just put him at a site and you know that he's safe for the whole game, right? He's sort of hard to interact with. Right. People like Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight can be like that. Qui-Gon Serene Jedi can be a little bit like that. Right, Guri can be a little bit like that on Stinger, right? Because the sort of space version where she says like a lot of decks just can't get through that. So cards like that you sort of know exactly what they're going to do in certain matchups, right? And mains against mains, those cards tend to be perfectly fine, but sometimes they really do lock things down.
Right. What types of cards stimulate your creativity?
I think for me, it's a lot of cards that sort of reward you for deploying in particular ways that sort of say like, okay, here, I'm going to play these 3 sites and these 2 systems, and then I can do this. And if my opponent does that, then I can go somewhere else. So those kinds of cards that, like things that like change your damage based on what something else is doing, things like that, right? So cards like the Old Allies objective, where it says like, okay, here's how you can reduce someone's damage, right? Here's how you can take control of the game in some way. I think probably those kinds of cards.
The sort of build around type cards where it's like
in terms of like where are you going to put characters, more so than like what cards are you going to combo with what other cards.
Okay. What types of cards make you want to quit the game?
I think I'm actually very open to lots of different cards. A lot of people have very strong feelings about like which decks they don't like playing against and which decks they do like playing against. And for me, it's more about like which decks do I get to play, right? If I can play decks that I like playing, then I'm generally pretty happy with that. And actually, it annoys me somewhat how much other people complain about cards that they don't like playing against. I wish people would talk more about like cards that they do like playing, because the problem is that everybody likes playing their own things. This is one of the hard parts about being on design is that everybody likes playing the decks that they like. Like, everyone has their own decks that they like, and every deck that somebody likes is a deck that makes someone else want to quit. And how do you deal with that? And in my perspective is just like, everyone's going to like, Lord Sidious, I said, was not a card that I particularly like having around, but I know that lots of other people do like it. And so, I'll figure out ways to play against it, and it won't ruin the enjoyment of the game, but it maybe like, hurts it very, very slightly.
Yeah, I certainly hear you about the how critical the community is. I've really, because a lot of the podcasts and stuff I make are media criticism, and I can be very opinionated and critical of a lot of things, but in spite of that, I do really try to try to make anything that I'm doing that's a piece of media criticism, make it more about celebrating the things that I like versus complaining about the things that I don't like. But I don't think I succeed at that. I still think I end up complaining most of the time. So,
and when you say like the use
hard.
of the word criticism and like media criticism or literature criticism, right? That's like a different meaning of the word criticism, where it's like analysis, right? Sometimes things are bad, sometimes things are good. Sometimes it's not even a judgment. It's right. It's just like because of this other thing happens.
Right. Well, when I'm using it, I mean, I guess it can mean both things at the same time, because I'm trying to do media criticism. I'm trying to do analysis.
But it's very easy to accidentally criticize something instead of analyzing it.
Yeah. Why did this? Why is this fun for me and this is not fun for me, as opposed to this is objectively good and this is objectively bad.
And the other thing is that when things are fun, right? When something's fun for you, you're playing, right?
Yeah.
When something's not fun, you're like, oh, I don't want to play. What should I do? I should go tell everybody else about how it went.
Right. Yeah. It is. If we're talking about the community, it is always interesting to me when there are people who are, this is, I feel like it's not even as bad as it used to be, but like, when I first came back in about 2019, there was a lot of argument about Like My Father Before Me. And honestly, the people that were complaining were actually probably right. I mean, it ended up getting errata and it was very dominant. But kind of me coming in as, I wasn't even a good player when I played, and I think I've gotten better since then, but I'm still not, not one of the best. But like, coming in and seeing the discussion, and it's like you've got the people who are saying actually there's lots of answers to this, to this card, and there's lots of options, and it's not, it's not overpowered and it's not dominant, and I play 10 games a week on Gemp. And then you've got somebody who's like, I haven't played since 2017. It's about, it's a little bit, it can be a little bit, I mean, people get set in their ways, but it also can be a little bit harder to take the person who maybe has stepped outside of, has stepped away, to take their critique quite as I don't know, they may not be quite as aware of where the game is actually at that given time, especially with Gemp, where a meta can, week to week, the open meta can change so drastically.
Right.
What is your favorite Star Wars term?
Like a term that we've come up with, like a
however you want to interpret it. Sometimes people will say, like a Star Wars CCG colloquialism. Some people will say just like a quote from the movies, or some people will say a keyword within the game. It's however you want to interpret it.
It was a really long time before I learned why a Twix was called a Twix. So I don't know what I mean. As a kid, we didn't watch very much television at all, and maybe they didn't. I don't think we really had Twixes much in Canada, or they definitely didn't advertise them. So I'd never seen the commercial. I don't know. I was just like, this is some term that someone came up with ages ago that is now has no meaning. I thought, right? And then at some point, someone was like, oh, there's this commercial.
I think that might be my favorite. But that might be my answer to that question is Twix. It is certainly my favorite thing when people say, why do they call it a Twix?
Right. Because there's actually a good reason.
Yeah.
But it's somehow also so ingrained in the terminology that you might even think this is just a natural word that's its own.
Yeah. I think, I certainly, it's been a term that we've used since the commercials were out. But I don't even necessarily think I made the connection the very first time that it's two for me and none for you. But I do remember the first time I got the question. I do remember the first time it came up on the forums from like somebody that didn't remember the commercial, and it was like one of those things where I kind of started to feel old.
Right. So I've never seen the commercial other than in the context of like looking it up to learn what a Twitch Star Wars was.
Oh yeah, see, it's the opposite for me. If I look up those, sometimes I will go down a rabbit hole and like watch all of the Twix two for me, none for you commercials, and there will be like a nostalgia button will be pushed because old commercials have such a way of doing that because like one, we watched them over and over and over and over and over back then, and then generally you don't revisit them the way that you would like a movie or something from your childhood.
But also we watched like how commercials are done change so slowly over time that you never realize that they used to be different. Right? There's like no one point where you're like, this is where commercials changed.
Right.
But then you go look back 20 years and they're so different from what they are these days. Just the sort of conventions and styles.
I mean, if you even watch commercials these days.
Right.
I every so often, like I'll be in a hotel room and just have to watch live TV, and it's like I can't even do it. Like how did we do it where every 30 minutes you had 8 minutes of commercials? What opponent's deck do you love to see?
I don't think I have very strong feelings about my opponent's deck in general, because I guess what do I like to see? So I have a few decks that I don't like to see.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, but in general, like apart from those, of course, like I'm playing a particular deck. I know I have good matchups. I know I have bad matchups. I'd rather see the good matchups than see the bad matchups. But I think that matters to me much more than anything else about what deck they're playing.
And what types of opponents' decks do you want to avoid?
So there's some like one-dimensional decks that I don't like. So these are things like Hidden Base or Restore Freedom, where and depending on like my particular deck, sometimes like a certain deck has kind of a one-dimensional matchup against another particular deck, just because they can't really interact with each other. And sort of when you flip those over, when someone flips over Restore Freedom, and you don't have that much to interact with in space. It's just all going to be about like what you draw in your opening hand, how fast can you get the damage going, how fast can they get damage going, what cards you lose off the top of your deck, and things like that. And those aren't really the games that I play Star Wars for, right? I want to have us. I don't need a battle to happen, but I want there to be at least like threats of battles and people moving from battles and protecting themselves from battles and things like that.
And for those of you who are like me and blanked on what is Restore Freedom, it's what the rest of us in the world call Yavin 4 Ops.
Right.
So which you mentioned Hidden Base and Y40. I have an answer to this question, and I'm curious if it's the same. Which do you like least between those two?
So I think it really depends on like the iteration. So let's talk about the current iterations.
Yeah, where we're at right now. Yeah.
And there I'd say I'd rather play against Hidden Base. And the reason is that the main thing that I don't like is the starship weapons. That's the main thing that makes it non-interactive a lot of the time. Because Restore Freedom at the moment, right? This is not always true historically, but at the moment, Restore Freedom tends to play more starship weapons and has more things using starship weapons than Hidden Base does. Hidden Base will sometimes have like one or two X-Wing cannons often. But that's sort of easier to deal with those than Restore Freedom, which will often these days have like two X-Wing cannons and two proton torpedoes and might have like some gunners and things like that. And often maybe a little bit more things that like cancel close call or things, right? Hear me babies and things like that.
So I've got a much more surface level reason that I prefer Hidden Base. I feel that I feel like Y40 consistently wins the damage race and wins in space. If you ignore Y4O, then they're probably going to win the damage race in most matchups. And then if you've got like a token space package, then it's very difficult because you have to interact with them, but they've got their whole deck built around that.
Right, because they might only go to 2 systems, right? And they're going to have like possibly 2 guys at each of the 2 systems, and they're guys with pilots, right? They're much more set up to fight in space.
Yeah. Whereas Hidden Base, I feel like you can get by with a token space package, and a lot of times they're if you're able to fight them head on, they're not going to win a fight head on. They have to get creative, and then also that kind of makes the game a little more interesting because even though I want most of my games to be about battling and force training, it is sometimes interesting when my opponent is like, playing it can wait on everything I deploy and moving around and having barely being able to draw Battle Destiny at a system and having 20 systems on the table.
You've got this choice of like, do I keep my 2 starships together and then I win any battle, or do I separate them and then I cover more, but they're maybe more vulnerable? There's sort of more decisions, it feels like, than
it's just I don't know. It's just like I feel like it's just Hidden Base is a more interesting deck, and I mean it's good to have. There should be a deck that just wins in space like that. That makes sense that for Yavin 4 Ops, but it's just like when I see that, I think it's that one-dimensional thing. It's like I always know how those games are going to go.
Yeah, and sometimes like there are certain decks where if you like your opponent flips over Rescue the Princess, depending on your deck, you might say, this is just going to be a one-dimensional game, right? Because they're at interior sites or something, or
right.
You can't interact with those particular characters. So there are other decks that are like sometimes one-dimensional. But of course, if you flip over Hunt Down and your opponent flips over Rescue the Princess, that's going to be interactive. So it's the hidden, like the space ones are just like much more often non-interactive.
Right. Because so much of the meta right now is ground based, is character based. I mean, Walkers is kind of a deck, but there's not really a light side speeders deck. So characters can go on the ground and in space. So a lot of characters are really important in the game right now, and are also one of the best ways to be able to interact.
Right. I guess another thing is characters can go in space, but ships can't go on the ground, right? So it's hard to play more than 4 or 5 ships.
Right.
So you can't, like, it's harder to sort of flex into space than it is to flex onto the ground.
Yeah, that's there's a new player in Slack named Jeff who is just like, it sounds like he spends 3 hours a day solitaring Premiere, but he always has these really interesting observations, and sometimes they're not right. But he had an observation a few weeks ago. He was like, why should you play characters end up in space and on the ground, but you can't go out. But if you're playing against somebody that's playing just ships, then their ships are just always in space, and you can't. Aren't ships like so much better because of that? And it's like, no, because of the other stuff. But his observations have been pretty interesting, and good observations for somebody that's. I keep telling him he should just learn open rather than spending so much time on his Premiere only decks. But everybody likes to play their own way.
Yeah.
What Star Wars job would you want to try? Now this could be Star Wars CCG related. It could be in universe Star Wars stuff, or it could be I think I had somebody say they wanted to be an actor.
In Star Wars.
Yeah, in Star Wars. So however you want to interpret it.
I feel like everyone in Star Wars is like either exploiting someone or being exploited or fighting. Right? Like none of the normal characters on anywhere other than Coruscant are like having a very fun time with things. I mean, but there are these characters that like, what was the guy from Mandalorian, the Ugnaught, who's just just hanging out on that planet.
Right. Yeah, I forget what the character's name was, but yeah, I know who you're talking about. The I Have Spoken guy.
Yeah, and he seems like he's having a quite fun time, right? So just sort of like all these like homesteaders on some barren world who've sort of just shown up and figured out which of the local animals that they can do something with, and that seems kind of like it might be. I mean, maybe it would get boring after a while, but that seems like a kind of fun thing to experience, right? And it's hard to have that experience in our world, right? Everything is sort of somehow manicured for us. Even if you go out somewhere quite wild, it's often still like kind of like there's still human impact almost everywhere. So it'd be kind of cool just to like set up camp somewhere. But on the other hand, you have like all this cool technology that makes it relatively easy.
What Star Wars job would you want to avoid?
And something like a moisture farmer seems quite unpleasant.
That's a fine line there. Then you think?
Yeah, I'd go for like a
Want to
more
be somebody that's out someplace remote, but not Tatooine.
not in the sand. I'd want like mountains and trees and water.
Yeah. Sand. I hate sand. It's coarse and rough.
Coarse and rough, irritating.
All right, and last question. What would you like to see with the future of the game?
I guess just we've been like so successful, right? And so just sort of staying that course, but also like trying to find in terms of the gameplay, trying to find new things that we can do. It gets hard to make new things that aren't just some combination of adding battle destinies and drawing cards and things like that. And so trying to find like new ways to keep things fresh, right?
That's the card. That's the card. Make it Destiny 3, but have it draw a card.
Right.
Add one battle draw the top card of your used pile and add one battle destiny.
And trying to identify
Destiny 3.
Like one of my favorite cards that I had a big part in designing recently was the Lothal Temple. Because I just thought like, you got 1/1s, you got 1/0s, 2/1 sites, 2/2 sites. We've even got a couple 3/2 sites, but we never made a 3/1 site. Right? What would it take to make a 3/1 site that was worth playing?
So I always float a Twix in my There's Good in Him deck, just like the Atsu saddle or something. And I've been trying out the 3/1 instead of that, just floating it. I don't think it's good, but activating 3 is good.
That's one of the things is like we want to ask people questions, right? I think like and maybe it's not good this time, right? But you ask the question. Someone else is going to ask the question some other time with some other deck, and maybe eventually someone will say like, yes, this is worth it in this deck. For whatever reason, I don't just want a Twix. I want somewhere that I could go to later, and I don't actually care that much if my opponent goes there for some reason. Right? And to ask those questions like, what does it take to make a 3/1 good enough?
Yeah, I mean, because it's like my thought process on it is technically there are probably situations where you want to get that third battleground, even if they're unrelated battlegrounds. It does cost extra if you're not deploying there, so your opponent's not super motivated to go there. I mean, obviously it's a drain of 3, so it's a little bit, so it is a liability, but yeah, and then activating one more. It's always good to activate more force.
All right, and you might decide that like There's Good in Him is if they only deploy one guy there because they're paying the +2, maybe you decide There's Good in Him is the kind of deck that would be really good at capitalizing on that, because like maybe that's a battle you could win, right? And then you stack another card.
Right, yeah, because they're deploy. It's not just the first guy that costs +2. Usually, if they want to, they're not really going to be able to stack there very quickly or very efficiently if you're not already there. Yeah.
Right, and so I think like finding those like new mechanics and new kinds of cards where the hardest kind of card to create is a card that it's very easy to create like cards that are just good, right? Like cards like Ray. And it's very easy to create cards that are only good in a particular kind of deck. But what's really hard is creating cards that are only good in a particular kind of deck, but aren't specifically designed for that deck, right? Where you create the card and it's not good enough to just immediately go into every deck. but it is going to get into a deck somewhere, but it's not clear when you make the card what that deck is going to be. Right? Those are the kinds of cards that are hard to create.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, MHT. Or do people call you MHT to your face, or do they call you Matt?
Yeah. People definitely call me MHT to my face.
Okay.
And not just in Star Wars. It's like it's like natural enough that it's had multiple independent.
Okay.
People have come up with it independently.
Yeah. That's I wanted to make sure. Because some nobody calls Chris Schoenthal Imrahil to his face.
As a kid, I used to be HT a lot because of course there's like so many Matthews around.
Okay.
And I think I like MHT better. It's somehow like it rolls off the tongue more easily.
Yeah. It's like it's like FDR or JFK. All right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully, I get this posted within some sort of time frame. I've got an interview with Drew Lichtenstein that's probably was posted before this one that is a few months old at this point. So, and yeah, make sure you're checking out the top 8 with Corran and Batmouse also on this feed. And we did for May 4th, we did a bad deck breakdown. So yeah, listen to all the stuff on the feed that you're already listening to. Thanks again, everyone. Until next time, good luck, have fun, and no reverts. This podcast is a production of the Kendallcast Podcast Network. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/Kendallcast or make a direct donation through the PayPal link at kendallcast.ninja. Thanks for listening. Yeah, we didn't talk as much about your history as I talk about the history with some people, but I don't know. It seemed like
talked more gameplay.
Seemed like yeah, and
Mitch isn't a better player.
Editing courtesy of the podcast intern.